All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. My name is Jim Hoadley. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for International Business Education Research at Georgia Tech. We're very happy that you are here to join us for our first live stream webcast. We're hoping that it's going to go well, but we ask your indulgence if anything doesn't go exactly right, but it seems to be in good shape. I have the extreme pleasure today to introduce your presenter, Dr. Deirdre Mendez. Dr. Mendez is a member of the faculty of the Department of Management at the McCombs School of Business at the University of Texas. She teaches intercultural management and teambuilding to undergraduates, MBA students, and executives. She's also Associate Director for Cultural Education of the Center for International Business Education Research at CIBER at the University of Texas at Austin. In this role, she oversees the development and implementation of programs designed to enhance the competitiveness of U.S. business through internationalization and business education. She holds a PhD in linguistics and worked as a consultant to U.S. corporations developing international strategies for 20 years before coming to UT Austin. Since returning to academia, she has been a leader in work at McCombs to develop resources that strengthen student and executives' adaptability to the international context. Dr. Mendez has developed an academic framework and training system to facilitate intercultural adaptability and problem solving. The Cultural Analysis Toolkit is currently used at the University of Texas and other universities to teach international management and leadership courses, help students and business people adapt to new cultural environments during study abroad, international internships, and service learning programs, and facilitate integration of culturally diverse teams of executives. With that, I will turn the presentation. Due to a technical glitch, I will be advancing the slides, but Dr. Mendez will be presenting. So if we have a little bit of a queuing issue, again, thank you for your understanding. So without further ado, Dr. Mendez.
Thank you, Jim. Can you hear me? I'm going to turn down the sound on my computer because I think I'm getting some feedback, and I hope that that makes everything okay. If there are any problems, just let me know. I'm delighted to be making this presentation. This is a subject that's very close to my heart. These are materials that we developed about 4 years ago in the Center for International Business Education and Research here at UT Austin. And the materials were developed really in the response to several trends in study abroad that we were seeing at the time. One is that these will all be familiar to all of you. One is that more students than ever are going abroad worldwide. Another is that programs are shorter. And then finally, we were hearing from studies on study abroad that from researchers that student learning from these shorter programs is less than what we had hoped in terms of cultural learning, that students now have these sort of what Jim once referred to me as drive-by cultural experiences, where they go and take a lot of pictures and have a great time meeting other exchange students, but don't necessarily connect with the host environment very thoroughly. So with this in mind, we developed this set of materials. And I will ask James to move on to the next slide that describes the goals for learning in the toolkit. The Cultural Analysis Toolkit was designed to deepen students' learning in country and to make them responsible for observing what they were seeing while they were abroad from a cultural perspective. So first of all, to deepen their understanding of the way people in the host country interact with each other, and to help contextualize the experience that they're having in terms of broader cultural tendencies. So that lady on the metro seemed rude to me, but now I have some additional context for recognizing that French people can be more direct than what I'm used to, and that this tendency actually has some benefits, and so on. Also, to develop some analytical skills for recognizing cultural difference. So students will study in one or two international contexts during their university career, but what does that tell them about working or living in other countries? And the cultural framework that is used in this cultural analysis approach that I'll be describing teaches students to recognize cultural difference in many forms in any new environment. So it's what the framework itself is applicable in new environments throughout the students' careers and lives, and can be used to enhance not only the skills but also the knowledge that they have of cultural difference. This is also a significant value add for recruiting. Students are always asking me, how do I demonstrate the value of my study abroad as being beyond simply an academic vacation? And by being able to say that they went to another country, they had to do an exercise where they evaluated the cultural tendencies and looked at ways in which those affect people's behavior and expectations and so on. And these are skills that they can then take back to the workplace. And whether they're going to work abroad or not, if they're American students, certainly the cultures of New York and Mississippi and California would be very different, and they can apply those or different corporate cultures that they might work in if they move from a large company to a small one. So these are very workplace relevant skills. And it's possible to incorporate a discussion of how to unpack the experience during recruiting. So these are skills that the students can describe on resumes and in interviews and so on to be successful. The next slide simply explains that this approach uses a cultural framework, and you're probably familiar with various cultural frameworks. There's going back to Edward Hall, the Hofstede framework and the Trompenaars Hampton-Turner framework and so on. This particular framework that I use is most similar to the Trompenaars Hampton-Turner framework, but I would say that these frameworks are all very similar, and really which one is used is not the point. The framework that I use is nothing new. It's simplified a little bit to make it easier for students to understand. But what these frameworks fundamentally do is take behaviors that students may see as random and a little difficult to understand and contextualize, and pull them out and discuss dimensions of culture that are different in different places so that they can make sense of them more easily. And the way that most of these frameworks, with the exception of Richard Lewis's very good framework, most of them use binary parameters. Richard Lewis's framework is a three-dimension framework, but generally speaking, there are continua with two different types of behavior, two different sets of expectations and worldviews at the opposite poles, and each one makes perfect sense in the environment that it comes from, but when people come together, they may have difficulty working together. So an example, an easy one to understand, is schedule orientation. People who have a strong schedule orientation tend to arrive early for meetings or on time. They tend to plan in advance. They don't like deadline pressure, so they like to get things done before the deadline, and so on. At the opposite end of the spectrum are people who have flow tendencies, and in any framework that you see, you'll see this same dimension, but possibly with different names. I call this a flow tendency. These would be people who come to get to the meeting late, and they're looking at their watch and talking on their cell phone and holding a cup of coffee at the same time, and they sit down and want to visit with people before they start and don't have the same kind of commitment to deadlines and schedules. And these people typically start projects much later and do the bulk of the work towards the very end. So in certain in certain national cultures, the infrastructure and expectations support a schedule orientation. In others, a schedule orientation would be a hindrance and an inconvenience rather than a skill. And each tendencies each tendency has advantages and disadvantages. So schedule-oriented people are very predictable, they're very reliable, but they're not extremely flexible, they're not extremely adaptable. Flow-oriented people are not terribly reliable or dependable, however, at least in terms of time. However, they're very good troubleshooters and problem solvers and so on. And so it's very important to explain to students that both tendencies have advantages, and the fact that the place that they're going doesn't exhibit the tendencies that they're used to doesn't mean that it is in any way inferior. People there simply have different things to deal with, and they come up with different solutions. So I'll give you an example, 2 examples from the framework, and we'll just play around with them a little bit so that you can see what the toolkit, this document that Jim has sent you as a PDF, and also he's also sent you a link to our website so that you can see the suite of materials that's available there. The next slide shows one of those cultural dimensions, and this is the dimension that relates to authority. And the authority dimension expresses how people perceive sources of authority and what they do about the rules in the environment that they operate in. So the icon on the left represents universalism, and universalists believe that pretty much everyone should obey all the rules all the time, because that's how civilization is maintained. And they don't like making exceptions. They don't like surprises. They want things to be structured. They feel that if there's a bad rule that they're asked to obey, they will even obey a bad rule because it's just the way to keep things stable. And we can all think of countries where universalist tendencies are strong. At the same time, particularism, which is represented by the icon on the right, is a perspective that every situation is unique. Particularists decide whether or not to obey a rule based on a variety of factors. One is their perception of the authority figure, or the people in authority who made the rule. Do they respect that organization or person's authority? Are they willing to go along with rules that that person or organization made? Another is whether it's convenient right now or whether it applies appropriately to them. So you'll hear particularists saying things like, well, I know that's the rule, but I'm just going to park in the handicapped space for a minute, or just this once, or, well, I'm really in a hurry, so I'm going to break the rule. So this is one of the dimensions in the framework, and the cultural framework that I use has 8 of these dimensions. Moving on to the next slide, I'll give you one more example, and this one is schedule and flow, and this is the one I described earlier, and this has to do with the way that people perceive and organize time. So for schedule-oriented people, time is linear. You can waste it. It's important to quantify it, to follow it. Schedule-oriented people consult their watches and their calendars, and they do work as much in advance as possible. Flow-oriented people on the right are multitaskers who move around, move schedules around as things come up. They don't expect things to happen exactly on time, and they may not be on time. So these are 2 of the tendencies from, 2 of the dimensions from the 8-dimension framework. And then I'll talk about the way students use it. Up to now, what you're seeing is nothing new. These kinds of tendencies are described in all of the cultural frameworks that are out there, but the way that they're used in cultural analysis is a little bit different. So the next slide shows how the toolkit is actually used. one of the departures of this approach from traditional approaches is that the cultural frameworks throughout their history have been used to characterize national cultures. Spain is polychronic. Brazil is particularist, and so on. And the problem with that approach is that there's tremendous variation, as we all know, within any country. And those are really artificial characterizations. And some of those characterizations even give you a number, some sort of reading for an entire country that is in fact extremely diverse. So the goal of cultural analysis is to have the students, instead of handing the students a profile of the country that they're going to and saying, this is what you will encounter, rather to have the students do the assessment on their own as they experience it. There's nothing wrong with showing them a country profile before departure, but it's important, I think, to let them know that they're going to be seeing one city or one cultural context or two or three within that country, and that they should recognize that there will be difference in different places that they visit, and that they can come to their own conclusions about what they're seeing based on their experience. And the toolkit materials show them how to do that. So the first thing that students do is complete a set of questions in the first section of the toolkit called Behaviors and Attitudes. And they can complete their own personal profile chart on page 34 by answering the questions. And this helps set up the idea that we all have our own culture, and it's not just the people in the host country who have a culture, that we come in with our own biases and preferences and so on. And there's a variety of ways that I use that self-evaluation to help students understand their own biases and their strengths and weaknesses in terms of flexibility and which tendencies they would have the most difficulty interacting with. And then once they arrive in their host country, then they begin to do an investigation of what is going on there. What are they seeing in traffic? What are they seeing in the class setting that at the university they're attending? What are they seeing in their homestay families? What can they observe in restaurants and so on? And so there's a section in the toolkit called Gathering Data that helps them investigate a variety of contexts where they can observe cultural difference. And from that difference, from the observation that they do, they can then construct a cultural profile of their host country so that they can say what they're seeing around them. And they can compare that to their own evaluation, and they can identify the areas where there's the most significant difference. So my students going to the Czech Republic recognize that Americans are relatively expressive, and we are also quite task-oriented, which means that we don't reserve smiles and friendly behavior for people in our inner circle, that we smile at strangers and talk to people at the bus stop, which is not necessarily the norm in other places. And they can see when they do their cultural profile of their host destination that things are different there, and they can get a sense of what the attitudes and expectations are of people in that environment. There's a section in the toolkit called Reactions and Interpretations. That section tells them the sorts of difficulty that people with their profile have interacting with people with the opposite tendency, and vice versa. So one thing that American students often don't recognize is that not only are they feeling a certain way about their host country, but people in the host country are judging them in similar manner. And so while we may think, a student may find that Brazilians are, it's difficult to get anything done there, and nothing happens on time, and it's very inefficient, Brazilians may find that an American student is being very uptight and inflexible, and so on. So getting a little bit of a mirror for their own behavior in that section. Then there's a section on coping with difference. That section provides some preliminary strategies for students who are struggling or trying to figure out how to deal with unfamiliar cultural patterns. And then finally, there's a section called Learning from Them that talks about what people in the host country are good at and how to create a persuasive argument based on their cultural tendencies. So again, some strategic problem-solving content in that section. The next slide shows how the data gathering is accomplished. There are a lot of things that students can observe. If they go to a restaurant and observe that people show up there, talk to their friends while they're eating, then push their dishes aside and talk for 2 more hours, and that the wait staff don't bother them throughout that whole time, they might recognize that people are very relationship-oriented rather than task-oriented. Also that they are more flow-oriented than schedule-oriented, and that they're prioritizing people and relationships over the schedule and moving through a process. They can look at traffic and recognize that rules are or aren't being followed and so on to get information from their environment. There are things they can read. There is information you can gain from signs, reading signs on the road, in grocery stores, from reading an annual report of a company or the way advertisements are structured and so on. Institutional visits and meetings, lots of opportunities there. Who makes it to the top? Is it always the oldest male, or are younger women in positions of responsibility and so on? How do people present information? How do they answer questions? That sort of thing. And then finally, casual interaction, obviously. Simply asking people questions about what they're observing is a very good way to learn about the cultural environment. So I'll just give you some examples now of the way that the toolkit is organized, and then I'll talk a little bit more about how it's being used in various environments. The next slide shows some examples, one example of a self-assessment question. So you can read this one, and then we'll move on, and you can answer a question about your response. Okay, so there's been a contract. The world market has changed. The contract is now not so good for one of the partners, and the partner is asking to renegotiate the contract. So take a look at the next slide. And see which of the responses here most closely matches yours. So if you responded that, well, a contract's a contract, it's already signed, the company that was buying the bauxite took a risk they shouldn't have signed if they didn't intend to take that risk, then you are, your response is more characteristic of a universalist approach. If you said, well, gosh, you know, a contract shouldn't be a bad deal for either partner, and even if the contract's been signed, there should be some room for renegotiating, then your response is more particularist. Most people respond somewhere in the middle, although I noticed that the younger people are, the more likely they are to have a more clear response. I think that possibly because they have less experience and they haven't had to deal with people who have different perspectives from their own. But what was very interesting to me was that several years ago I did a presentation from a group of students. I knew there were 2 groups, and I did a pre-departure orientation for them, and I used this example. And I said, how many of you answered response number 1? And half the room raised their hands, but they were all the half sitting on the right-hand side of the room. And then I asked about answer number 2, and the left side of the room raised their hands. And I was very surprised by this. So I said, well, what's the difference? And it turned out that these two groups were an accounting class and a marketing class. And they were all sitting with their friends. So the room was almost divided in half. And it turns out that accounting students are highly universalist. No surprise there, really. They like structure. They like rules. They want to know what to do to be safe and correct. Whereas marketing students are all about figuring out a creative new solution and getting around obstacles. So that was a very interesting experience. So you can ask your students to fill out the profile on page 34, answering questions like this for each of the 8 dimensions. And it takes about 20 minutes, and they can do it in advance. The next slide is just an example of an exercise that I sometimes do with students to practice using the toolkit. And I'll just walk you through how you could use the toolkit to answer the questions for this scenario. So go ahead and read it, and then we'll take a look. All right, so I show this slide, and then I ask students to look at the toolkit to answer the questions. And we won't go through that whole exercise, but I'll show you on the next slide what they would see if they did. Obviously, what's going on here is a schedule flow difference, and I use this example because it's the easiest one of the 8 dimensions for students to recognize and understand. So from the gathering data section, they would be able to see that the cultural feature responsible is difference between schedule and flow orientations. Then I would ask them to look at, to answer number 2, I would ask them to look at the reactions and interpretations section. The question there is how her Brazilian counterparts probably feel about her behavior and expectations. So she could see that people with strong flow tendencies tend to see people with schedule tendencies as being uptight and inflexible and maybe a little bit unfriendly. So this is, again, reminding them that they have a culture and that they are perceived by people in their host country just as they judge them. And I'd like to emphasize the examples I'm giving you are taken from presentations that I do to US American students, but you could certainly change them to reflect any cultural tendencies you wanted to for students from any country going to any country. And then the question number 3, the coping with difference section, gives some strategies that Christine might use to lessen her frustration. One is, and cultivate smooth relationships with Brazilians. On the one hand, how can she manage things so she's not frustrated, but also how can she interact with Brazilians more successfully rather than expect them to accommodate her? And then finally, the learning from them section gives instructions for explaining your own cultural bias and why you do the things you do and the way that people think in your environment, and asking people to explain theirs so that we can learn from them. Offers additional strategies, and then talks about what Brazilians are good are good at that U.S. Americans may not be based on our tendencies, and how Christine could benefit from learning some of those. The next slide describes some student assignments that are given in various programs that I do. The most basic of these is to conduct an in-country analysis of some sort, where the students complete their own personal profile. I usually have them do that before they leave. They go abroad, they identify cultural features for cultural tendencies that they're seeing in their host environment. For very short-term programs, I might choose a set of cultural tendencies to research. So if they're going to Brazil, I would probably include schedule or flow. Or if I thought that was going to be too easy, I might choose universalism and particularism as ones that the students would be able to recognize relatively easily. I would not include individualism and collectivism in Brazil because that one's a little bit confusing, but if the students were going to an Asian country, I would probably include that dimension. So you can mix and match. And then I have the students relate what they're seeing in country to their personal profile and talk about any frustrations that they're having and so on. And then finally, I end by asking them to articulate the transferable skills that they're gaining from doing this analysis. Sometimes they resist doing the analysis. They'll tell me that it's not natural to analyze all of your interactions, and I point out that we constantly analyze all of our interactions. We just aren't aware of it, and we're just making it more explicit through these exercises. But when they have actually gone to the trouble to do an analysis and to think strategically about dealing with people in their host environment, then they do bring back transferable skills that are applicable in the workplace. And it's possible to help them sort of unpack their experience and talk about a difficult experience that they had and how they managed it and what transferable skills they've gained that they can describe in recruiting and so on. One thing that I often have students do is take pictures. The next slide shows an example of this. The students do in-country observations, and this is one of the observations I received in image form. So this student is seeing an example of particularism. He was shortchanged at a currency exchange and obviously very frustrated by this experience. And one reason I enjoy this example is that if you look at this receipt, you can see that it was wadded up into a small ball. He was frustrated. He was probably going to throw it away, and it suddenly dawned on him that he could use it for the cultural analysis assignment because it's a great example of particularism. This is the sort of thing that you would not expect to see in the US, his home country, and so it was a good example from his study abroad. And I can give you examples from for all 8 tendencies if that's something that you're interested in. The following slide shows the way that that people can use these materials. They're open access materials. They're available on our website. Many of you have already downloaded the cultural toolkit from that site. There is, in addition to the toolkit itself, which is the handbook that the students use in country, there is an explanatory video about why we did it and what it's designed to do. There's also a sample pre-departure presentation based on the ones that I do. That is a PDF document. I'm sorry, it is not a PDF. It's a PowerPoint. which means that you can pull the graphics out of the presentation and use them in your own presentation to link the graphics in the toolkit to the ones that, that you show the students. There's a sample student assignment so that you can get an idea of the way students are instructed to carry out an in-country analysis and a sample of student work. This approach is being used. I teach it in 8 different courses. I've taught it in online courses to students who are abroad. I've taught it to students who are here in country working on intercultural teams. I teach it in a standard on-campus 3-credit course every spring to students who are not studying abroad or working on intercultural teams. We use the approach in our certificate in global management. Students take an introductory course in the approach. They go abroad using the materials. They come back. We deconstruct their experience and talk about the way that what they saw abroad relates to management issues and corporate cultures. It's used in programs as short as a few weeks. Actually, our MBA program uses it in study tours that are only a week long, and all the way up to year-long study abroad. So it can be used in a variety of ways, and I'm happy to be a resource for anyone who's looking for exercises or a sample syllabus, sample exams, or any other related materials, and to talk to you about how to repurpose the materials for your own needs depending on the structure and the nature of the programs that you're doing. The Cultural Analysis Toolkit itself has a lot of business examples, something of a business focus, even just the study abroad version that you have. That's because we're a business school, and this was part of the requirement for the federal grant that funded the development of the materials. At the same time, a lot of programs that are not, have no connection with business are using the materials, and it can be helpful to have the business focus in the materials when you're talking to students about how they might see these cultural tendencies manifested in a workplace environment. That's really what I wanted to tell you about, and I'm going to ask James to let me know if there are questions, and I would be delighted to take any questions that you have.
All right. Thank you very much for a fantastic presentation, Deirdre. I am not seeing questions yet, but we are on a bit of a delay. So we'll give everybody a second or two to catch up with us and to share their questions on the live chat stream on YouTube. All right. Okay. Yes, again, opening it up. If anybody has any questions, I know that we are still on a slight delay. Seeing a little bit of response. Mostly people saying thank you for joining us. We really appreciate you taking time out, particularly the Friday before Memorial Day for those who are in the U.S. Oh, here we get some questions. First question, can you hear me, Deirdre? Maybe that's the problem. Okay. All right, can you hear me, Deirdre? Hello? Uh-oh. Are you still there, Deirdre? Okay, one more try. Oh. Okay, we seem to be having a technical problem right now, everyone. Very sorry for that. Let's see. Okay. For those who are still on, who can hear me, we have lost our audio link with Dr. Mendez, unfortunately, right at the end. But we will. I have everyone's questions, and I have your emails. If you, which
hello, can you hear me?
Oh, are you there? I can hear you. Hey. All right. Can we try again? Can you hear me? So what we will do is we will take the questions from the comment side, and we will respond to them via email. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. We appreciate it. We hope that you got benefit out of it, and we hope to have some more of these in the very near future. So please continue to follow us and join us. We hope to join you again on a webinar in the near future. Apologies, I'm doing multiple things at the same time. But once again, thank you everyone for joining us, and we wish you well. Have a good evening.